The noise was punishing, wind across the surface, the constant pulse of screws, the distant crash of waves. In that cacophony, a single echo could make the difference between safety and loss. Seconds scraped into minutes, and silence weighted every man. Some thought they had been sent on a fool's errand, stretching thin while submarines closed from the flanks. Then one operator stiffened. Faint, uncertain, but there. It was not random surf or metal debris. The rhythm repeated, steady and deliberate, a sound no storm could fake. He called contact. Another set confirmed. Bearings aligned. A submarine lay inside the sweep, just where WATU's boards predicted it would be. Hithot gave the order. Engines adjusted, depth charges primed, crews at stations braced against the spray. A run was made across the suspected position, charges rolled free into the black water, and moments later detonated with muffled thunder that shook through decks as though the ocean itself had convulsed. Foam erupted aft, men thrown against bulkheads by the concussive roll. The convoy behind staggered but held course. More charges followed. Systematic patterns dropped to keep the prey pinned down. Reports later revealed what those men only sensed in the moment. The submarine had taken heavy damage, its patrol ruined. It limped away toward base, unable to continue the hunt. It was not a kill, and no wreckage confirmed its end, but withdrawing a boat from the fight was victory enough. The Conv carried on under the auroral sky, fewer losses than circumstance had promised. For the first time, Raspberry, tested against real steel and torpedoes, had bent the odds in the Allies' favor. Relief seeped across the escorts. After years absorbing blows, they had struck back with method rather than chance. Exhausted sailors shared thin smiles, not in celebration but in recognition. Something in the balance had shifted. Senior officers reading the after-action reports later saw the same point, stripped of emotion. A new tactic, devised in Liverpool by Wrens and skeptics, had forced an attacking submarine to retreat where accepted doctrine had failed. That was enough to push doubt aside. Raspberry was not a game. It had proven itself under the harshest test possible. Convoy SC-104 was not the end of the battle, nor the last convoy to lose ships to Wolfpacks, but it marked a subtle turning point. For once, escorts had wrested initiative from the hunters, and the proof of this success, written into official signals, began to spread across the Atlantic theater. It was no longer argument, it was combat testimony. Outcomes like this provided exactly the evidence Admiralty needed to integrate Raspberry into wider doctrine, moving it from experiment to accepted practice. What followed would be tracked not only in stories of ships that escaped destruction, but in the ledgers of men studying results. Over time, these engagements left a trail of figures, losses, tonnage delivered, submarines forced away, that gave a clearer picture than any single night at sea could provide. Numbers rewritten by 2025 analysis. When wartime commanders recalled Raspberry's effect, their evidence often rested on memory, reports scribbled under pressure, anecdotes traded in wardrooms, or the recollections of exhausted survivors. These accounts conveyed the atmosphere of change, but lacked measurable clarity. Only in the past decade have researchers applied modern tools to the surviving records. Between 2018 and 2025, digitization of convoy archives allowed thousands of journeys to be compared and tested as if they were datasets in an economic study. Patterns that wartime officers could never have plotted in real time became sharply visible. For the first time, Raspberry's impact could be expressed not just in testimony, but in statistical terms. The most telling results appear in convoy survival itself. Before Raspberry, escort formations were consistently penetrated, and loss rates hovered at levels that threatened Britain's imports. Convoys suffered multiple sinkings in single assaults, and averages over weeks suggested the collapse of shipping was a looming possibility. Once Raspberry spread through the escort forces, the trend line did not fade gradually, it shifted decisively. Historical analysis shows that after 1943, convoy survival improved even as the enemy increased pressure. What had appeared a losing battle suddenly stabilized. The contrast is obvious when set against the graphs. The drift toward disaster arrested in the same month's Raspberry became routine practice. Crucially, this reversal did not happen because the German effort slackened. On the contrary, German records show submarine deployments expanded in both 1942 and 1943. Their Wolfpacks roamed further into the Atlantic, and patrols launched in greater volume. Yet the outcomes of those patrols tell a different story. In 1942, loss figures show roughly 1 boat destroyed for every 9 sent to sea. By 1943, the proportion had changed dramatically, closer to 1 in 5 never returned. This meant that a German commander now sailed with the expectation that survival was far less certain. These failures were not caused by accidents of weather or luck, but by escorts equipped with tactics that put submarines where they could be detected and hunted. Escorts trained at Liverpool began to apply their sweeps with consistency, forcing infiltrating submarines to remain submerged until their batteries drained, or exposing them under the glare of star shells. These actions shifted the mathematics of the campaign. A hunt that once offered the attacker relative safety now ended with greater frequency in a crippled hull or a final sinking. The geometry first sketched across chalkboards began to manifest in casualty rates, and that statistical increase in submarine losses weakened the entire assault strategy the German Navy relied upon. The improvement in convoy survival is further underscored in tonnage statistics. Britain's imports, which had declined through 1942, began to rise from mid-1943 onward, despite more U-boats at sea. Essentials such as grain, oil, and munitions reached ports in higher volumes. The fact that deliveries increased while enemy pressure grew is the clearest indicator that convoy escorts had gained the upper hand. Each saved freighter preserved tens of thousands of tons of cargo, enough to maintain food reserves, industrial throughput, and the equipment needed for campaigns far from the Atlantic. The scale of this effect reached into strategy. With shipping more secure, Allied planners gained confidence to move beyond mere survival and begin amassing forces for renewed offensives. The buildup of troops and material required for the Italian campaign, and later Normandy, depended on convoys that could deliver consistently. The narrowing of risks at sea directly enabled operations on land. Without it, the transatlantic bridge of men and weapons would never have accumulated in such numbers. Raspberry's influence was therefore not limited to ocean survival. It underpinned the logistics of the wider war. Modern studies also highlight the link between tactical innovation and psychological endurance. Before data analysis, successful sinkings of U-boats were explained as chance encounters. Luck or storms seemed decisive. Once records were compiled chronologically, a new picture emerged. U-boat casualties rose in line with the maneuver's introduction, revealing that what once felt like random fortune was the result of systemic change. This recognition transformed probability. Escort crews who had grown used to frustration found themselves equipped with realistic methods of detection, and the knowledge that their odds had improved reshaped morale. It confirmed both to the men and to their commanders that survival was now closer within their grasp. Statistics show that the initiative remained contested. Convoys still lost ships, and skilled U-boat commanders adapted when they could. Raspberry altered the balance by narrowing surprise. Submarines no longer operated with near impunity. By rendering their infiltrations more dangerous, escorts shifted the odds and redefined the campaign as a contest of endurance the Allies could sustain. That shift in probability, though measured in percentages on charts, carried immediate human consequence in the confidence of crews and the willingness of governments to plan in longer horizons. It is for these reasons that modern analysts place Raspberry alongside the other celebrated breakthroughs of the Atlantic War. Radar extended vision, code-breaking stripped signals of secrecy, long-range aircraft closed the mid-ocean gap. Raspberry's contribution was different but comparable because it altered U-boat tactics at the level of daily engagement. Where technology expanded awareness, Raspberry restructured response. Together, these measures created a multi-layered system of defense, each working in tandem. Numbers from recent studies confirm that Raspberry's effect in reducing losses and increasing kill rates was not minor. but decisive enough to stand among these giants. One credibility anchor rests in the scope of WATU itself. From February 1942 to July 1945, the Western Approaches Tactical Unit ran weekly courses, ultimately training around 5,000 officers. This diffusion of knowledge meant Raspberry spread not as a niche experiment, but as a fleet-wide doctrine. Admiral Max Horton's acceptance of WATU's demonstrations secured the authority necessary for implementation. Without Horton's endorsement, no amount of statistical proof today would matter, because the tactic might never have reached the sea lanes. The fact that it did, and that new analysis validates its effectiveness, closes the circle between invention, adoption, and measured outcome. By setting these findings against broader data, modern historians conclude that Raspberry reduced losses on a scale that shifted strategy across the Atlantic. It turned Conv operations from a gamble into a sustainable system and weakened the German campaign at its core. More than that, the analysis illustrates what can happen when institutions risk unorthodox solutions. Evidence from 2025 supports what Roberts and his Wrens believed in 1942, that a handful of ideas tested on mats could hold consequences equal to any machine pulled from a laboratory or factory. These results also point forward. Raspberry proved that once adaptation was possible, it could be repeated. Wargaming enabled ideas to be tested quickly, refined, and pushed back into the fleet before the enemy adjusted. The data underscores a final lesson. The enduring victory lay not only in one tactic, but in demonstrating that innovation itself could be systematized. The work of 2025 therefore reminds us that Raspberry's greatest contribution may not be a set of sweeps and star shells, but the precedent it created. It showed that assumptions could be overturned, that doctrine was not fixed, and that survival in the Atlantic required continual rethinking. From that moment, convoy defense was no longer about holding to established patterns, but about treating tactical change as a permanent necessity. The path this opened did not stop with Raspberry, it began there. From Raspberry to a doctrine of innovation. Operation Raspberry marked only the beginning of WATU's work. Once the Liverpool team demonstrated that a convoy could defend itself by calculated sweeps, each new wrinkle in U-boat behavior became another problem to solve on the mats at Derby House. Games multiplied, the boards reset again and again, and the Wrens refined counters until makeshift drawings advanced into formal tactics. Out of those trials grew a catalogue of maneuvers with their own distinctive names. Half Raspberry adapted the original triangular sweep for convoys with fewer escorts. Pineapple was built for the chaos of multiple Wolfpack boats striking at once. Banana covered solitary attacks. Beta Search targeted shadowing submarines waiting for their moment to close. And Step Aside provided the first counter to a new German weapon, the acoustic torpedo, or T5 NAT. Each maneuver was tested, discarded, or improved until its logic held against dozens of simulated runs. Nothing left that room by guesswork. In many ways, this evolution built naturally on the work of Johnny Walker's earlier Buttercup maneuver. Raspberry had begun as a correction to Buttercup, stripping away its assumption that submarines always attacked from outside the conv. Now, the fruit-named cousins carried the inheritance forward. Together, they formed a coherent series of experiments, each arising from the reality of convoy defense under pressure. The shift this represented went beyond the details of each maneuver. Before WATU's work in 1942 and 1943, Doctrine had rested on tradition. Officers were expected to replicate fixed patterns and hold formations rigidly, trusting that discipline itself would overcome the enemy. With WATU, that picture inverted. Convoy commanders were no longer judged by rote adherence, but by their willingness to accept new drills when presented with convincing evidence. It meant that earlier tactics were treated not as scripture, but as provisional. Once circumstances changed, yesterday's solution could and should be discarded. For the first time, adaptability became a defining responsibility. The new commander-in-chief of Western Approaches, Admiral Max Horton, personified the change. Houghton was a celebrated submariner from the First World War and an officer steeped in established naval thinking. His first encounters with WATU carried the skepticism common among senior commanders, that games run by Roberts, Wrens, and convalescent officers were amateur distractions beside the grind of real convoy duty. But Houghton accepted an invitation to test the method himself. Guided onto the boards by Wrens, he played out a scenario as a U-boat commander and quickly found his moves anticipated and punished. A 20-year-old Wren outmaneuvered him completely. For Houghton, the display was stark. What skepticism could dismiss on paper worked unmistakably in practice. Far from covering his embarrassment, he used the episode to endorse WATU and draw it closer to fleet strategy. With his backing, the gap between experimental game and operational order closed. This endorsement carried consequences for how officers measured themselves. A commander's standing was no longer tied only to how well he enforced drill or punished slackness. Increasingly, authority attached to his ability to think like the enemy. On the boards, that skill determined whether he lost merchants within minutes or preserved them. The lessons were sharp enough to erode pride. Distinguished captains often found themselves outfought by Wrens wielding chalk and logic. The humiliation was deliberate because it taught them to shed assumptions before rejoining the convoy lanes. Officers who could not adapt gave way to others who could. WATU's teaching extended far beyond Liverpool. Its week-long courses ran without interruption from 1942 onward, graduating around 5,000 officers by war's end. Those officers did not come only from Britain. Canadians, Americans, Free French, Norwegians, and others cycled through the program, each exposed to the same boards, the same markers, and the same expectation that survival meant continuous adaptation. By 1943, training schools in Halifax, Londonderry, and elsewhere replicated the model. The effect was standardization. Multinational escort groups could meet for the first time and already share a tactical vocabulary. Simple signals now carried shared meaning because their training tracks had crossed at Liverpool. The United States Navy's eventual adoption of British convoy practice magnified this exchange. In 1942, sinkings along its coastline had forced a reluctant abandonment of solo sailings. Once convoy escorts were in place, WATU's catalogue of responses traveled across the Atlantic with them. What had begun as improvisations in a chalk-dusted room became shared practice for navies facing the same Wolfpacks on distant coasts. Each maneuver reflected a direct reply to German innovation. Pineapple forced a second or third U-boat to dive before attacking, keeping Wolfpacks from unleashing their salvos in unison. Banana built in protective zigzag sonar sweeps tailored against lone attackers. Beta Search anticipated the movements of shadowing boats after they submerged, guiding escorts into systematic patterns that denied them the chance to lurk untouched. Step Aside directly confronted the new T-5 Nat acoustic torpedo, commanding escorts to alter speed and course sharply so that the homing devices exhausted themselves without a strike. In each, the principle repeated. Every fresh danger demanded a fresh counter. The cycle had become institutional. The practical effect of this culture was clear. Officers returned to see expecting innovation as routine. They trained their crews not to cling to an unchanging script, but to treat new orders as inevitable responses to the enemy's next move. For many, this was their first introduction to war as a contest of adaptation rather than endurance. It shifted how convoys were defended. Escorts fought not as reactive guardians, but as predators seeking angles against their unseen opponents. The Wrens tabletop games had fostered a serious recognition that thinking like a U-boat mattered as much as spotting one. Trimmed of rhetoric, the lesson was plain. Doctrine itself had changed. Instead of a single formula defending convoys for the duration of the war, commanders now worked within a system that assumed its own evolution. Manuals could be rewritten each season, and fresh graduates could expect that the drills they had just learned might be replaced within months. WATU had established the precedent. Tactics must be temporary, doctrine must be alive, and the officer corps must think with the same flexibility as its enemy. From that shift came measurable consequences. Allied escort captains who embraced these methods no longer entered the ocean lanes with only hope. They sailed equipped with the most current set of answers to U-boat tactics, and their survival rates reflected that difference. Conv, defense had been transformed from static ordeal into continuous contest, supported by a doctrine of invention. That doctrinal shift meant convoys no longer sailed on hope. They sailed with new thinking that produced measurable survival gains. And soon, those gains would be put to their greatest test, in the widest waters where Wolfpacks gathered far from all land. The battle of mid-ocean and the statistics of survival. The most decisive fighting in the Atlantic came not near the coasts, but in the deep mid-ocean, days from any landfall or rescue. By 1942, German command identified a vast region sailors called the Air Gap, where Allied patrol planes from Newfoundland and Britain could not reach. Across nearly 1,000 miles, the horizon held no possibility of air cover. For Admiral Dönitz, this gap became the natural battlefield. If Wolfpacks massed in its center, convoys would be forced to pass through with only escorts between them and destruction. The geography favored him. Along coastal routes, aircraft had forced U-boats to submerge during daylight hours, breaking their ability to stalk convoys freely. In the air gap, no such threat existed. Surfaced boats could charge ahead, regroup, and launch in coordination under cover of night. Radio reports from scouting boats positioned entire packs across the convoy's expected track.